A few weeks ago, I had a message from a student that said, "Hi Liam, coming from the water industry, can you give your take on differences of content between process control narratives and functional design specifications with projects you've done in UK water industries?" I find there's a lot of confrontation or confliction around these documents. Now, they've also put in process engineer slash programmer. So I think what they're actually getting at is the difference between how process engineers think about putting things together and how programmers then implement those things. And I can say that, yes, I've felt that friction before between process engineers putting things together and how programmers would interpret that, especially when it comes to logical processes over actual process reasons, depending on what you're treating, what you're doing, what your process actually is. It can be somewhat difficult sometimes to get across the limitations that a PLC or a control system that you're using may have. And also, I think on the other side of that same coin, it can be quite difficult for a process engineer to represent what they want to happen in a way that a programmer can actually utilize it to write logic. And I think my biggest takeaway from this sort of thing, what I found has helped me the most, is to write a diagram as opposed to a wordy paragraph that explains what you're doing. I've never really been on the process engineer side or the side that specifies a document because I write logic myself, but I have had to sit down and write an actual flow diagram or function chart because of me being unable to understand what it is that someone actually wants in a document. And if the basic rule is if you can write it as a flow diagram, you can write it as logic. So if you're a process engineer who is looking to get the best method of conveying what it is that you want to happen in your process, I advise you to try and sketch out a basic flow diagram that explains what you want to happen. And if you're finding it difficult to do that, then I think there's merit in your programmer coming back to you and saying, this is a little bit more difficult than I envision this to be. And I think sometimes when programmers push back on specs and say this is difficult and it doesn't sound difficult to explain, but it's difficult to implement, that diagram can come in really, really handy to just help express between the two parties where we're coming from. And it doesn't fix everything. Like, I'm not saying that everything should be written down in a flow diagram format, but sometimes, especially for sequences and for interlocking and things like that, safety as well can come into this. If you have a uh, visual representation of what it is you're trying to do, that can go a really, really long way to help both parties understand the complexity of what it is you're dealing with. As for the projects that I've done in the water industry, mine have been more maintenance specific than actual bespoke writing. In my earlier years, anyway, where I had the most of my experience in the water industry, and I think a lot of it is quite standardized. People like to think that they have the bespoke solution for everything, but the common approach that most software engineers would take to deliver something is pretty similar. I'm yet to come across somebody who's doing something drastically different to either the way I would do it or the way the last person did it. And most programmers out there or software engineers that are working in automation spaces have a similar mindset about how they go about things. Of course, there's always things that people disagree on. Should you be using functions or function blocks? Should you be using global data or should you be using interfaces to pass data around your project? There's always that sort of stuff. And the biggest one, should you be using ladder logic or structured text? But with that stuff taken aside, most programmers are doing the same thing or roughly the same thing. The bit that has a lot more variability is how projects are defined and how they're written in order for programming to take place. And I think that that comes with wherever the business that you're working in is really. Are you working in a business where it's just you and you're not only specifying things, you're writing it as well? Because there's a lot of that happens. Or are you working in a 30-man team that has process engineers or people who are writing the specs for things, and then someone completely different is doing the programming? And both of them can work just as well. People who work for themselves will spec their own solutions to problems, and I think a lot of those people do very, very well for themselves. So I don't think there's any massive difference of content. I think the thing that is worthwhile remembering is the document that sits between the people who do the control narratives or the specifications and the people who do the actual programming needs to be of decent quality. It needs to be easy to digest for both parties, because it's easy to write a specification and then not be able to actually digest it again later. So it needs to have a structure around it, or a common approach that business takes. And I think that there can be a lot of conflict around those documents. And I think sometimes it also happens where the actual output is not in line with what happens in the document anyway. So yeah, I think my sort of my take on the differences is there isn't a difference if you're both aligned with what the bit in the middle, the communication in the middle, is going to be. And I hope I've interpreted that question correctly and given some thoughtful points to ponder upon on that, because it's a broad spectrum out there of what people do in order to design and then deliver a project, the people involved, and also the documentation that goes along with it.